In 1829, a fur trapper named David Jackson was making his way through the American West, one of thousands of working men who fanned out across the frontier to hunt and trap and survive off the land. Jackson kept returning to one particular valley in what is now Wyoming. It was a deep, wide valley, completely ringed by mountains, so enclosed, so dramatic that you don't just enter it, you descend into it. His trapping partners, Jedediah Smith and William Sublette, noticed how much time he spent there, and so they named the valley after him. They had a specific word for valleys like this, valleys so deep and so completely swallowed by the mountains around them that it felt like falling into the earth itself. Valleys like that were called a hole, and it became Jackson's Hole, a working man's valley, named by men who went there to work. For the next 150 years or so, that's more or less what it remained, a rugged, remote, spectacular corner of Wyoming. Ranchers and outfitters populated it, and a ski town grew out of it. Jackson Hole continued to be a place where people came to experience something wild and real. But over the last few decades, things began to change. Slowly at first. Working ranchers sold to out-of-state buyers. Luxury lodges replaced old outfitter camps. The wealthy discovered Jackson Hole, and the ultra-wealthy and the private jet set discovered it. Now, Wyoming had never had a state income tax, so word of that got around, and by the time the 21st century rolled around, Jackson Hole had already become one of the most exclusive addresses in America. But then came 2017, and what had been a slow transformation became something else entirely. When Donald Trump signed his tax cuts into law that December, Wyoming became one of the most attractive wealth destinations in the entire country. The new federal rules made it dramatically easier for the ultra-wealthy to shield their assets, to establish trusts, and to relocate their fortunes. Billionaires descended on Teton County, where Jackson Hole sits, the way David Jackson's fellow trappers once descended into the valley itself. But these new men had not come to work the land. They came to own the land. The transformation was as swift as it was staggering, and for the people who had always called this place home, it was devastating. Teton County has become something that economists and sociologists and political scientists are increasingly pointing to as a warning, not just an example of inequality, a preview of it, a window into where this country is heading if nothing changes. The numbers, which I like to dwell on, are almost impossible to comprehend. The top 1% of households in Teton County now earn 221 times more than everyone else who lives there. Not twice as much, not 10 times as much, 221 times as much. The median home price, which means half of all homes sell for more and half sell for less, has surpassed $3 million. What does that look like on the ground in the actual lived human reality of that valley? It looks like this. The people who make that place work, the dishwashers, the landscapers, the lift operators, the hotel housekeepers, many of them cannot afford to live anywhere near the town where they spend their days. Some of them are sleeping in their cars. In Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the richest country on earth. It was named for a working man, by working men, where working men can no longer afford to live. So here's the question I want you to sit with this morning. What if Jackson Hole isn't the exception? What if Jackson Hole is a bellwether for what's coming? Because the same forces that turned one of America's most breathtaking mountain towns into a place where working people cannot survive, those forces are no longer contained to one zip code in Wyoming. They are reshaping this country, all of it, top to bottom. And those forces have a friend in the White House. Nearly half of Americans today don't have enough savings to cover a single $1,000 emergency. In the richest country on earth, millions of families are essentially one car repair away from financial ruin. That's not a talking point. That's current data from Bankrate. Even those who do have an emergency account, the average balance is now about $5,000, roughly half of what it was last year. More than 40% of Americans say they've got no emergency fund at all, none. A third of Americans say they couldn't cover even 1 month of living expenses if they lost their income. A majority, 59%, say their savings would last no more than 3 months. Forget about being a billionaire. Forget about even being a millionaire. In Trump's America, millions of people are lucky, genuinely lucky, if they can count themselves thousandaires. A report just this week found that more Americans than ever are rating their 401k retirement savings, the money they set aside for retirement, for their dignity in old age, just to cover mortgages and everyday bills. Not a lavish vacation, not any kind of splurge. Their mortgage, their groceries, their gas. Here's what makes all of this so striking. It isn't happening in a vacuum. It isn't happening because of bad luck or some unavoidable force of nature. It's happening at the exact same moment that the people at the very top of this economy are accumulating wealth at a pace that would make the robber barons blush. Between 2017, the year of Trump's tax cuts, and 2025, the wealth of America's richest households didn't grow, it exploded. According to a recent New York Times report, the net worth of the top 1% grew by an astonishing 120%. The number of American billionaires jumped by roughly 50%. That's the real divide in Trump's America. It's not red and blue. It's not urban and rural. It's the people sleeping in their cars in Jackson Hole and the people who own the lodges that they can see from the parking lot that they're sleeping in. That gap, that chasm, that's the story of this moment. And this morning, we're going to follow it from one working man's valley in Wyoming all the way to the halls of the United States government. Trump ran as a populist. He stood at rallies across this country. He promised to fight for forgotten Americans, the workers, the veterans, the people who felt left behind. But his signature economic policy, the 2017 tax cuts, delivered its biggest rewards not to those forgotten Americans, but to corporations and the wealthiest households in the country. Those tax cuts helped fuel a stock market surge that minted hundreds of new billionaires. A huge share of those gains flowed upward as corporate taxes were slashed and companies spent billions buying back their own shares. The people who already owned most of those assets, the people who already possessed great wealth, became vastly richer. The people who were already struggling, they're still struggling. In many cases, they're struggling more. Which brings us to the part of the story that goes beyond economics. Because when wealth concentrates this dramatically, when the distance between the top and everyone else becomes this vast, it doesn't just reshape the economy, it begins to reshape power itself. In the last election cycle, for every dollar donated by billionaires to Democrats, $5 went to Republicans. Much of that money came from ultra-wealthy tech and finance figures who aligned themselves with Donald Trump's tax cuts and deregulation agenda. And boy, did Trump deliver for them. At least a dozen billionaires were given roles inside the Trump administration itself. Let that sink in for a moment. Not just donors, not just advisors calling in from the outside. People who appear on the Forbes billionaires list are running federal agencies, shaping federal policy, sitting inside the White House. And it's not just at the federal level. Across this country, billionaires are pouring unprecedented sums into races that most Americans barely know are happening. State attorney general races, county commission seats, increasingly the courts themselves. Take Pennsylvania's recent race for state attorney general. Nearly 90% of the outside money supporting that campaign came from one single billionaire, the richest man in the state, who spent tens of millions of dollars backing his preferred candidate. In Wisconsin, a state Supreme Court election last year became the most expensive judicial race in American history as billionaires from across the country, including notably Elon Musk, flooded the race with millions of dollars. Elections that used to be decided by voters are increasingly becoming contests measured by the billionaires who are bankrolling them. Former Montana governor and Republican National Committee chairman Mark Racicot told the New York Times he remembers a time when wealthy donors hesitated to give too much money to political campaigns. They worried it might look like they were buying influence. How quaint. Roughly 3/4 of Americans want limits on how much money individuals or organizations can spend on political campaigns. More than half of Americans, 53%, say billionaires themselves pose a threat to democracy. Nearly 70% say the ultra-wealthy should play a smaller role in American politics. 71% of Americans support some form of a billionaire tax. And almost everyone, 94% of Americans, agree that the wealth gap in this country is getting wider. That 94% should be 100% because that's not an opinion, it's a fact. Now, I want to be clear about something because this argument gets mischaracterized. Most Americans are not angered by success. This country was built on the idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, on the promise that hard work and ingenuity can take you anywhere. But that ideal assumes a level playing field. What Americans resent, what they're telling us in poll after poll after poll, is a system where the ultra-rich play by one set of rules and everyone else plays by another. A system where wealth doesn't just buy comfort, it buys wholesale impunity. Scott Ellis, a former technology executive and a member of a group called Patriotic Millionaires that advocates for higher taxes on the ultra-wealthy, put it with striking clarity. Quote, at some point, there's nothing you can spend money on that actually makes your life materially better, so money simply becomes power. The question for us is not how much wealth we want other people to have, but how much power, end quote. How much power? That question is at the heart of everything Americans are grappling with right now. And for many of them, the Epstein scandal has come to symbolize exactly that kind of system, one where immense wealth and powerful connections appear to place certain people permanently above the rules that govern everyone else. The scandal pulled back the curtain on what some lawmakers now call the Epstein class, a network of ultra-wealthy elites whose status has time and again appeared to insulate them from any consequences whatsoever. Or as Congressman Ro Khanna, a crusader for justice in the Epstein case, recently put it.
Most people don't begrudge people who have, do well and build wealth, but they begrudge the fact that if they have a different set of rules, and they begrudge the fact that they can't have a secure economic future for their families.
And I bring up the Epstein case for a reason. At last month's hearing on the Epstein case, the Attorney General Pam Bondi was asked a direct and specific question about the case and the investigation, and this is what she said.
None of them asked Merrick Garland over the last 4 years one word about Jeffrey Epstein. How ironic is that? You know why? Because Donald Trump, the Dow right now is over. The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader, as I hear, Raskin. The Dow is over 50,000 right now. The S&P at almost 7,000. And the NASDAQ smashing records. Americans' 401ks and retirement savings are booming. That's what we should be talking about.
That's what we should be talking about. What officials like Pam Bondi appear not to understand, or perhaps understand perfectly and simply don't care about, is that stock market numbers are cold comfort to the 1/3 of Americans who couldn't survive a single month without a paycheck. They are cold comfort to the families raiding their retirement savings to pay rent. They mean nothing to the workers in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, who are sleeping in their cars. There is now a resounding sense across this country that the rules of the system have been rewritten quietly, deliberately, and very much on purpose for a very small group at the very top. The same forces that reshaped one working man's valley in Wyoming are reshaping towns and cities and counties across the United States of America. As the midterm elections get underway, the question on voters' minds is not complicated. In fact, it's very, very simple. Who does the American economy and our democracy really work for anymore?
The title for the event, the tour, Senator Sanders, that you've been on, called the Fighting Oligarchy Tour. This is one of those stops. I think one of the people I think that you would consider an oligarch, and I think probably fits the textbook definition, would be Jeff Bezos. Of course, you know, one or two richest men in the world, depending on what the stock is doing that day. And there's been an interesting debate that's opened up about taxes, about tax fairness. Particularly different Democrats have had different proposals about tax fairness. And I want to play something he said about his own tax verdict and get your response, Mr. Plattner, and yours, Senator Sanders. This is what he had to say about the idea of doubling his taxes and that it wouldn't really help very much. Take a listen.
If people want me to pay more billions, right, then let's have that debate. But don't pretend, you know, that's going to solve the problem. You could double the taxes I pay, and it's not going to help that teacher in Queens. I promise you.
Mr. Plattner, what do you think of that?
Oh, I think it's abject nonsense. I think that's what somebody says when they don't want to see their taxes go up. There's absolutely no question that if we target the wealth where it has been hoarded, frankly, for decades at this point, and we pull it back into our system and put it into social programs like healthcare, like childcare, like paying teachers what they are worth, we will absolutely improve the lives of working Americans and, quite frankly, improve our society as a whole. It's, I think what he is pitching is propaganda. It's meant to protect himself and protect his crony friends. And, we're going to come after them for it.
Senator, he also pivoted to an idea of like cutting taxes. No one in the bottom 50% would pay any taxes. There's been a lot of Democrats, interestingly, proposing things along that line, big exemptions at the bottom. I think Senator Booker has a version, Senator Van Hollen. People, I think, who talk about this progressive. Congresswoman AOC has come out against it, saying, look, the best way that we build a kind of society and tax system that works for all is that everyone's paying in and everyone's benefiting, more like what we see around Social Security, Medicare, more what we see in Europe. Where are you on that?
Well, what I know is that today we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had in the history of this country, much worse than the so-called Gilded Age. And I know that at a time when the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 93%, when people like Bezos and Musk own more wealth than, so many Americans combined. Musk himself owns more wealth than the bottom 53% of American households. Meanwhile, the effective tax rate of billionaires is lower than that of a nurse or a truck driver. So, of course, we need to demand that the wealthiest people in this country, the billionaire class, start paying their fair share of taxes, which is why I've introduced legislation calling for a 5% annual tax on the wealth of billionaires. That's less than 1,000 Americans. And, Chris, if we do that, we raise enough revenue to provide a $3,000 check for every man, woman, and child in families under 150,000. We can make sure that everybody who was thrown off of health care by Trump gets reinstated. And we can do enormous things for the American people. The point is, there is so much inequality right now that taxes on billionaires can transform life for the working class of this country, which is right now struggling to pay the bills.
Mr. Plattner, you're trying to make the case to the folks in your home state of Maine to vote out a 5-term incumbent, someone who's been a real, I think it's fair to say, an institution in Maine life, and comes from a sort of political family and has been there for a very long time, probably has name recognition north of 99%, I think it's fair to say, in Maine, who has beaten back other challenges. Why do you think, what is different this time? What is the case for why Mainers should turn away from someone who has been such an institution in that state through Democratic and Republican institutions?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, because as an institution, she has overseen the deterioration of material conditions for working people in this state. I mean, where we are today is worse than where we were when she entered the Senate. We have fewer hospitals. We have fewer schools. Housing has become an abject nightmare for younger people in the state, and elderly for that matter. We have seen people living on fixed incomes see their benefits continue to stay small while the price of everything else goes up. She has been in the U.S. Senate through all of this. And more importantly, she has votes on her record time and time again that show that she is not willing to go out of her way to either stand up to Donald Trump, stand up to the Republican Party, or stand up on behalf of the working people in her state. She had a charade for a long time that she was an independent. I think that charade is very much come to an end because of the reality that we're living in. But it's not going to keep the people that support her from dumping in as much money as they possibly can. The billionaire backers of Susan Collins, they know the stakes of this race. Any road to a Democratic Senate goes through the state of Maine. They're spending accordingly. And I will say for those watching, if you want to help out, GrahamForSenate.com. We can really use it.
Senator, your thoughts as someone who's known and worked with, I mean, obviously across the aisle, but you're one state over. You've known Susan Collins for a long time. What do you think about Mr. Plattner's chances?
Well, I think Graham is going to win. And I think he is going to win because the people in Maine, the people in Vermont, people all over this country understand that right now the economy is totally rigged. So what's going on right now? People on top have never, ever had it so good. While working families struggle, or elderly people can't afford their prescription drugs, while young people, everything being equal, will have a lower standard of living than their parents. So what kind of economy is that? And the people also understand, as Graham just said, that the political system, campaign finance, totally rigged. Does anybody in their right mind think that it's a good idea for our democracy that billionaires can pour unbelievable amounts of money to defeat candidates like Graham or other progressive candidates around the country? That's a corrupt campaign finance system. And nibbling around the edges and establishment politics and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, we're beyond that right now. The system is broken. The system is corrupt. The system is dominated by the billionaire class. People want real change in Maine, in Vermont, and all over this country. That is why Graham is going to win.
I saw an article yesterday. We were starting to get some of the money filings for these independent expenditures, right? Who are the biggest donors in this cycle? Mark Andreessen, who's a big right-wing tech guy who is one of the most sort of like zealous boosters of AI and right-wing politics, and says things on podcasts like no one should ever engage in self-reflection. It's an actual thing he said. It's a real quote. He's actually the number one donor in this cycle so far. I think it's $115 million he's given so far. And Senator Sanders, the last thing for you, because you've been spending some time talking and thinking about AI in ways I found interesting. I've watched some of your videos. I've listened to some of what you said. The Pope, first American Pope Leo, had a very interesting address on AI, sort of talking about the possibility and the peril of it, and comparing it to the threat of a biblical Tower of Babel. How do you think about that interest as it sort of lingers and over this campaign?
I think it's a huge issue. I think every American should be thinking, what does it mean when the very wealthiest people in this country, Musk, Bezos, Zuckerberg, Ellison, and others, are spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to develop and implement AI and robotics? What does it mean when Jeff Bezos is putting together a $100 billion fund to, quote unquote, automate factories? What it means is that tens of millions of jobs in the next decade will likely be disappearing. And what happens to the working class of this country then? What it also means is that we have to worry about our politics, putting stuff on television where people, or on social media, people will not know the difference between what's true and what is made up and false. We got to worry about the existential threat, Chris, because scientists tell us that as AI becomes smarter than human beings, it can become independent of human control with potentially catastrophic results. It is a huge issue. And the billionaires and big tech say, hey, we don't want any regulation. And Trump says, we don't want any regulation. Let us do whatever we want. The hell with what happens. Well, I think the American people disagree. It's an issue of great importance in this campaign.
In fact, final little note is that last week they're going to put out their first ever regulation on it, which is going to be voluntary. And the president's number one AI man, David Sachs, called him at the last minute because industry didn't want it, and they canceled it. Lo and behold, so that did not get issued.
Musk did as well.
Yes. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, Maine Senate candidate Graham Plattner here on this Memorial Day, and they will be doing that rally later today. I appreciate you gentlemen making time for us on this day.
There is no problem of racist speech on campus. There is no problem with racism. There is no problem with sexism. Or to the extent there is a problem, it is not very big. One of the reasons multiculturalism was able to get off the ground in the first place is that most college-age students, and especially those who are attending our top universities, are not bigots. There are very few who are. And so I think one of the really big problems we have to come to grips with is this sense in which the reason we have racial tensions in our society, the reason we have other kinds of tensions, is not because there is a problem with racism and other forms of oppression, but because people are looking for these things too much.
That was then 28-year-old Peter Thiel promoting his book at an event hosted by the Heritage Foundation in 1996. The book was titled The Diversity Myth, Multiculturalism, and the Politics of Intolerance at Stanford. Thiel co-authored the book with David Sachs, who's the focus of an extensive piece out this week in The Atlantic titled The Venture Capitalist Populist, How David Sachs and the New Tech Right Went Full MAGA and Captured Washington. And we'll talk in a minute about how that actually may not be good for MAGA in the long run. But with us now, again, the author of that piece, staff writer at The Atlantic, George Packer. Back by popular demand, George, the kids were crying out. Like voices in the wilderness, more Packer, more Packer. So here you are. I wanted to talk about three people, David Sachs, who you've profiled, Elon Musk, and Peter Thiel, all of them either from South Africa or spent formative years in South Africa. I know you don't piece them together that way. But I just think it's fascinating that three people, either from or people that spent formative time in South Africa, would have such a powerful impact. And also, all three, and we can go through it specifically, are harshly critical of Western democracy and do not think that liberal democracy is the preferred form of government. Talk about David Sachs and his views and the others as far as you're comfortable talking about them?
Well, I've spent quite a bit of time with Thiel some years ago when I was writing about him, and you're absolutely right that Thiel has famously said freedom and democracy are incompatible, meaning for him to be able to live his life as he wants and make money as he wants is impossible under a liberal democracy where people who have the vote who don't believe in his libertarian views. Sachs is not very interested in political philosophy in my research. He is an entrepreneur and a venture capitalist, and he is mostly interested in making money. So he and Thiel go way back to Stanford. They were at the Stanford Review together, which was a conservative publication Thiel founded. They then were at PayPal, which Thiel co-founded with Musk, and where Sachs played an important part. They have a long history. And now what's really interesting, Joe, is how, having kept their distance on Washington, because they really didn't believe in any role for government in their industry, in technology, they now have kind of captured the Trump administration. And Sachs spent a year as Trump's AI and crypto advisor. And in that year, he essentially aligned government policy with the wishes of those industries and not with what I would consider more the public interest. And so in a way, they've now come around, having been hardcore libertarians all their lives, to a view that government can actually be useful to their financial interests, their business interests, and their sense that really the world should be ruled by a small number of very smart, very wealthy men, which is, I guess, another word for oligarchy.
Well, you know, they believe in capitalism when it comes to single mothers who they think should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But when it comes to tech billionaires, they're all for socialism, all for the federal government giving them money and helping them out. Well, Sachs Sachs, hasn't he said, accused the United States of provoking Putin into war with Ukraine? And again, in other ways, again, sort of aligned himself with Putin, Orban, and sort of that anti-liberal democracy right?
He has. And for a long time, I couldn't understand how someone who really does seem to care about facts and about logic and is a very good debater on his podcast could end up sympathetic to the Russian role in invading Ukraine and trying to destroy that country and absorb it into the Russian Empire. To be charitable, he's pretty ignorant about the history of that region and the politics of that region. But the way I came to see it was of a piece with his approach to business, which is essentially there's no moral calculation here. It's not about whether Ukraine has the right to sovereignty, whether we should support a democratic country under siege from an authoritarian empire. None of that seems to come into play. And so once you take away the moral analysis of that war, you end up thinking, well, Ukraine's a risky bet. As Trump once said, they don't seem to have the cards, although actually right now they do have some cards. And you end up sympathizing with Putin and Russia because morality has been replaced by a cold calculation of where your interests lie. And maybe if you're afraid of escalation toward World War III, well, that's going to be bad for your portfolio. And so let's tone this down and give Putin what he wants. That's my best analysis of how Sachs comes to the ridiculous position that he holds.
It is a ridiculous position, Claire McCaskill. But here you have, and of course, we haven't even talked about Elon Musk from South Africa, but yet another person whose formative years were influenced in South Africa, having a disproportionate influence on American government right now, these sort of billionaire tech overlords who see themselves as, sort of gods who are beyond reproach. And with Elon Musk, you have somebody who will tell you that was not a Nazi salute. It certainly looked like a Nazi salute to most of the free world. But he regularly calls Democratic allies tyrants. He promotes the most extreme far-right groups that have ties to fascism. He promotes conspiracy theories and hate speech on X. And again, just generally seems to be a skeptic of Western democracy, of liberal democracy, of the democracy that has been responsible for the American century. And I will say also responsible for the liberation of more people out of poverty than any other political system.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about these tech bros is that a lot of the people who have bent the knee to Donald Trump that were in positions of power in various institutions, law firms, universities, they did so out of fear. But I think George has hit on something here that I think we don't underline enough. These guys are bending the knee because of opportunity. They see a guy who can be moved easily with flattery and wealth and, coming in with a lot of bravado. And they've used those positions to get what they want out of Donald Trump. Now, the problem for him is politically what that does to the MAGA base, because when I saw those billionaires surrounding him at the inaugural, and when I look at the omelet line at Mar-a-Lago and who is surrounding Donald Trump there, and all the gold and all the gilt, at some point, the MAGA base, which does not look anything like Peter Thiel or Sachs or Musk, they begin to go, wait a minute, is this guy really for me? Because he doesn't even understand that gas prices are killing me. Talk about how this romance is hurting Donald Trump with his base.
And I think one evidence is just yesterday, the White House announced that after claiming that all the concerns about AI safety were just Biden era wokeness, they abolished his safety institute, AI Safety Institute. They're now backtracking and saying, well, actually, we are going to have AI models report their safety tests to the government. Why? Exactly as Senator McCaskill has said, because their base, their populist base, mostly working class, is afraid of AI. The numbers make that clear. And they don't see it quite the same way that David Sachs and Peter Thiel do. One more thing I wanted to say, Joe, you mentioned Western democracy. These guys use the phrase Western civilization as a kind of flag that they're waving when they criticize the European democracies. But what do they mean by it? That's the real puzzle, because if Donald Trump, who tried to overthrow an elected government, is the embodiment of Western civilization, it doesn't mean to them what it means to me and maybe to you.
Well, I mean, it's what's so bizarre. They talk about Western civilization as a code word. I don't know if there's some racial aspect to, quote, Western civilization. But the great irony is Western civilization is defined Churchill, 1940, Battle of Britain, U.S. troops scaling, the cliffs of Normandy to save Western civilization, to save Europe from Soviet tyranny. And now they reject, when they're talking about Western democracy, the freedom fighters in Ukraine and blame everybody but Vladimir Putin. It is truly bizarre. George Packer, thank you for coming back on Morning Joe. George Packer, the one-man show, will continue on Morning Joe indefinitely. But right now, you can read his new piece online, and it'll be in this month's issue of the Atlantic magazine. George, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it.
Should billionaires be taxed based on their wealth? A new ballot initiative in California says yes, but the Democratic governor out there says no. Joining us, former California Democratic Senator Barbara Boxer, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy, Betsy Stevenson, and politics reporter at Semaphore, Dave Weigel. Dave, lay out the foundation of this for us. What exactly is this California initiative asking for?
Well, you set it up pretty well. It's asking for a tax on wealth, not income taxes. The question of how to tax wealth, which has been around for quite a while, which Elizabeth Warren really attacked in the 2020 campaign, was what to do about the capital and pieces of wealth owned by billionaires, how to get some revenue from that for the state. The referendum would do that, would come up with a way to do that, and they've attracted by my count this morning, I think it's still coming in with tens of millions of dollars into a PAC funded by billionaires to stop it. The argument being that the state benefits right now from having billionaires in it. It benefits from the IPOs they create, the taxes the state gets from those. You'd waste that all if you come up with any mechanism to take their wealth away because they can quit. And the California, if you sing Gavin Newsom's role in this, Newsom doesn't like this idea because California is competing with other states that can promise zero taxation of the resources and assets we're talking about to these billionaires.
So doesn't he have a point, Barbara? We've seen in other states that have tried to pass a wealth tax or who have passed a wealth tax, those billionaires, those very rich people, move to friendlier places. Lots of movement, for instance, to Florida.
Absolutely. And it's happening right here, right now, before the vote. A couple of the founders of Google. I mean, it makes me really sad that people are so interested in building so much wealth that they can't even stay in the state that made them wealthy. But that is the fact. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Gavin Newsom. I know he sees, where the taxes are coming from. We don't want to lose high income people. I just want to say one thing in closing this. Let's look at the big picture. This has to be done at the national level. I agree with Elizabeth Warren, and I agree with her bill, and I would be a co-sponsor of it. There's only 75,000 individuals worth $50 million or more in this country. They are paying, on average, a lower effective rate than a teacher or a nurse or a truck driver. And then you put on top of that the big, beautiful bill, which gave these people even more. We need to do something. It ought to be at the national level. Otherwise, people will move around and states will get hurt.
Betsy, how do you get at it, though? Because I think the senator's right to bring up the federal aspect of this, that people can just move around. It's got to be a federal bill. But how do you actually get at the wealth fairly? Because a lot of these CEOs, one of the reasons why they pay such a low tax rate is that they don't have an income, or they have a very low income on paper when they're actually accumulating quite a bit of money, through stocks and equity, et cetera. How do you get at that fairly?
Well, I mean, one thing is that we have designed a system that lets them that allows them to pretend that they have very little income, even though they spend as if they have a lot of income. What they do is that income stays tied up in stocks that are appreciating in value. So they can see on paper they're getting wealthier. They go to banks. They structure financial deals so that they can borrow against that. I want to just emphasize for people the difference between thinking about millionaire tax, like think about Washington State that's trying to introduce an income tax only on the amount of income people earn above $1 million, and a tax on billionaires. If you're a millionaire in wealth, you could spend $100,000 a year and you'd be out of money in 10 years. A billionaire can spend $100,000 a year for 10,000 years. So that is a long time that they get to spend a ton of money. And one of the things that makes me sad is that people would leave a state like California because they don't want to pay 5% in taxes when they can't actually spend that wealth in their lifetime. And what they're basically saying is,
why don't they want to? What's the holdup? Why?
I think it's because of their ego. They think that they know what to do best. And so that's really about power more than it is about, spending. And I think if we're going to be in a democracy, they need to give some of that power back to the rest of the voters, to the government that the voters have elected, to provide the things that the society wants.
So there are some federal moves to try to get this done. Congress has been working on a few different proposals. There's also a proposal by a couple of Democratic senators, Dave, that doesn't talk about taxing billionaires, but instead talks about taking away income tax from people who make, I think in one of the scenarios, it's less than $80,000. And in another scenario, it's a little bit less than that. So there's an effort being made here. I think there are people in Congress who realize that this is a political necessity and perhaps something that they can win with in the next election cycle.
It's a very chaotic debate inside the party because I can't even limit it to two factions, but let's say generally there's one faction of Democrats who say we need to get elected and prove the government works and that it's worth paying taxes in order to get better health care, to get better transportation, to get better services, et cetera. And there's the other faction of Democrats that are worried that just doesn't work. It's too easy to demagogue their failures in big cities sometimes. Sometimes there are failures that people are paying a lot of money for. You ask somebody in an expensive part of San Francisco if they're getting services as good as somebody in a good part of San Jose. There are real debates inside the Democratic Party about whether that works. So what you're seeing from Chris Van Hollen, Cory Booker, and in California from Katie Porter is this promise from Democrats that we're going to shrink the tax base, get more people who are making less money off of it so they pay nothing and they can spend money on themselves, and tax the ultra-rich more. It's very contentious because to a lot of Democrats that says you're never going to get the kind of welfare state that a lot of them joined the party to create if you tell people that taxation is inherently bad, you're better off if you're not paying it, but if you make too much money, if you're a billionaire, then you should be paying for everybody else. They worry that's a very slippery slope and you lose the argument that makes people want to vote for Democrats in the first place.
I think people would love to pay more taxes, given no one wants to pay more taxes. But I think it would be easier to swallow if services were rendered for those taxes, good services were rendered. And I think you bring up a good point that even in places where taxes are very high, the services can feel a little wanting. Dave, always good to have you. Just to be on the record so I don't mess it up, Van Hollen's proposal is no income tax for individuals under $46,000, married couples making under $92,000. Senator Booker, the number's slightly different. It's for individuals under $37,500 and for married couples under $75,000. All right, Dave Weigel, Barbara Boxer, thank you guys so much for joining us.
For more on this, maybe he's got an answer. Matt Stoller joins me. He's the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. He's also the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Matt, I'm beginning to think that this is one of those things that is going to start to dissolve around party lines, because a whole lot of people who validly supported Donald Trump because he said he would make things fairer for them understand what everybody else understands, that nothing has become fairer for the working person in America.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have a billionaire crisis, and that's pretty obvious to everyone. And I think you hit it on the nail on the head when you talked about the Epstein class and brought that up, because the Epstein class really signifies, for the first time that I've ever seen, that the culture war that we've usually had between the left and the right, working people on both sides, is now actually tilted towards the billionaire class, because people are starting to realize that billionaires are seizing control of our politics, while life for ordinary Americans is getting harder. And billionaires are even ruining our industries. So this is a crisis, and it's something that I think people are now increasingly aware of.
And look, I want to be clear. This has been going on for a long time, decades, not just a couple of years. But the 2017 tax cuts and last year's big, beautiful bill did things to accelerate this. It supercharged the billionaire class.
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, in 1980, there were less than a handful of billionaires. And today there are thousands of billionaires. And it's not because, inflation increased and so the same net worth is just a little bit higher today. No, in fact, what has happened is we have structured our economy around creating billionaires, and something like the Trump tax cuts, both versions of it, but also a whole set of policies, regulatory policies, enforcement priorities, facilitates the increase of wealth at the very top. I mean, you can look at something like, on Monday, the Trump administration tried to settle and effectively pardon the company Ticketmaster, which is run by someone who is near a billionaire, maybe a billionaire. And when that happened, the stock popped by 7%. And the CEO, who is the largest shareholder, his net worth pretty dramatically increased. And a different example would be Paramount is now trying to buy Warner, and that is going to lead to huge layoffs. There's all sorts of political scandals about it. But the CEO of Warner Brothers, David Zaslav, is going to earn $500 to $600 million in the transaction and become a billionaire. So it's not just that, sad people are becoming wealthy and these policies help increase, their wealth. It's also that our jobs and our welfare is worsening precisely because our wealth is being stolen and appropriated by these extremely wealthy guys and the political leaders who are abetting them.
And one of the things you write a lot about is that monopoly is not it's not an economic thing. I mean, it's thought of as economics, but you discuss how monopoly is a democratic problem.
Right. A monopoly is just basically a dictatorship of an industry, right? It's political control. And it just happens to be in the economic sphere. But if you talk to somebody who works in any monopolized industries, and increasingly most of our industries are controlled by a small group of, by either one company or a small group of them, if you talk to people in that industry, they are scared of that dominant player. They won't talk about it because they are frightened. And that's not just a question of, oh, their bank account shows a certain number of zeros or not. That is a function of their liberty. And look, poor people are afraid to speak out. But at this point, even wealthier people, if you're not super wealthy, even wealthier people are afraid to speak out because of the level of control in our economy, and everything from meat packing to entertainment to row crops, wherever you look, it's dominant control. And so when you start to see more authoritarianism coming into politics, it's because people have gotten used to that authoritarianism in their daily life, in the way they work, and who they sell to, and who they buy from, and so on and so forth.
Well, it's an important conversation because everybody's leaning into the conversation of affordability, but it's not a matter you solve unto itself. It is a policy issue that has to be discussed that will result in greater affordability or at least greater wealth for working and middle-class people. We'll have that discussion another time. Matt, thank you as always. Matt Stoller is the Director of Research for the American Economic Liberties Project and the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy.